Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that I'm sure you are very familiar with, and that, or at least have heard a lot about, and that is decandling, and specifically Japanese black pine decandling. To place the technique in context is to ask the question of why do we need to decandle? So decandling is, of course, the growth of it's the vegetative growth of the needles, which are referred to as the spring needles. So it's a spring candle that comes out in spring, and that growth is what we cut off, which is the process, or what we're referring to when we talk about decandling. And then because of the response of the tree, two needle pines or double flush pines, the trees have a unique ability to produce a second flush of growth, namely summer candles, which then produce the summer needles. And of course this growth is a little bit smaller than the growth that would have occurred in spring. So what happens if we don't decandle? Well, if we don't decandle, then obviously the growth that extends in spring is going to remain, which means that the tree's volume of foliage, or the outline of the tree, is going to consistently or continuously become larger. It's going to extend. So if you're trying to keep the tree to a certain profile, so you're obviously, the decandling is of course a technique that is most appropriately used on refined trees. And so if your goal is to withhold or hold the tree at a certain size, then decandling is a very important, or it's a critical technique in order to maintain that goal. You could also see decandling as very similar to pruning on a deciduous tree, except the difference is that pruning on a deciduous tree can generally be performed at any time during the growing season. But with conifers, or with pines, double flush pines, with decandling, you are restricted to a fairly specific, a time-sensitive window in which you can do it. The objective also with decandling is also that at every cut site or cut point, you will hopefully produce at least 2 new buds. And so decandling is very important for building the ramification of pines. So in summary, decandling is a vital technique that every Japanese black pine grower either needs to perfect or needs to learn more about, because it enables you to retain the tree or maintain the tree at the size that you want it to be. In other words, it's not going to get any larger. To maintain a delicate branch structure, because of course if these branches are allowed to develop, the candles upon candles upon candles, those branches are going to become very coarse. And of course you don't want that, because as you get closer to the periphery of the or the outline of your silhouette of the tree, the canopy, those branchlets need to become thinner, more delicate. And then finally, the last point, or last critical point to make, is that it is the means by which you achieve an increased level or degree of ramification in 2 needle pines. Another question to answer would be if decandling is appropriate to use on all Japanese black pines. And I recently did a video focusing on the appropriate use of various techniques of Japanese black pine, and I will link to that video in this video. But to answer the question, it is no. Decandling is generally a technique that is used on developed trees, so trees that are in refinement. Of course there are exceptions to that, but usually it is reserved for enhanced or refined trees. And the next question would be whether the technique of decandling can be used on any Japanese black pine that is refined, or said in a different way, what are the requirements or what should one look for to tell whether a tree can be decandled in that season or if it should rather be avoided? And the answer to that would be that if you have repotted the tree that spring, then you will not be doing decandling that same season because the tree is usually too weak. So the strength of the tree, the strength of the candles, of course, are the indicator that you need to consider, or is the indicator that you need to consider when determining whether you can go ahead and decandle a tree or not. So the tree needs to be healthy and strong. So usually as a precursor to decandling season, you would be fertilizing your trees quite aggressively from the beginning of spring. And that is to build up resources that the tree has in order to push out the summer candles and subsequent needles. So you'll be using fertilizers that have a good amount of nitrogen in them, and then typically just before you are going to decandle, a couple of weeks before the time, you can either remove that fertilizer or just make sure that you don't put any fresh fertilizer down, because of course if you keep fertilizing the tree, after decandling, the new growth will come out and be largely the same strength as the initial flush in spring. If we use this tree on my bench as an example, you can see the strong candles that have developed this spring, and this is what we're looking for as an indicator to tell us whether we can go ahead and decandle the tree or not. If you have weak candles, so it's if all the candles around the tree are very weak, there obviously will be weaker candles on this tree as well, but you're looking at an average sort of degree or level of strength. But if the candles are generally weak, then it's probably best just to wait until the following season and maybe just continue fertilizing and help the tree to build up more reserves so that in the following season you can decandle, because the tree will hopefully then be strong enough. The other question that you must ask is when to decandle. So the timing of decandling is quite important, because it's based on, it's almost like a reverse, so you've got to work it out in reverse. So when you decandle, there will be a certain amount of time left of the growing season, and it's that time period that you're allowing the tree to develop the new growth, the summer candles. If that period is too short, then the candles will not develop properly and they'll more than likely be very stunted. If you do it too early, then the chances are that the candles are going to continue to extend and just become too big. So it kind of renders the application of the technique in the first place being somewhat pointless. So it is I would say that's the art of the decandling process, is knowing when to decandle. But I must also say, in my personal experience, that I think that there is a certain degree of luck that is involved as well, because if during that subsequent growing period you have periods of extreme heat or extreme cold for that matter, and the tree stops growing, then of course that will influence the length of the growing season that remains as well. I generally find in the Western Cape of South Africa, where I live, that a tree of this size needs to be decandled around the middle of December, and that is the time that I would usually do it. So that introduces another consideration, which is the size of the tree. To decandle a large tree or to decandle a small tree would be done at different times. So you would do larger trees first, because the size of the needles that develop from the summer candles will of course be larger, because they're being given a longer growing period to develop, and they will still be in scale with that size of tree. If you have very small pines, then you need to delay the decandling, because you want to limit the size of the needles development, the summer needle development, because a smaller needle will be more would look nicer on a smaller tree. So it is playing with the timing to also help you to achieve a smaller needle, which will give you an overall better effect or better look to the tree. On the subject of what you will need to do the decandling, there's not too many tools that are actually necessary, but what is vital, of course, is going to be a pair of trimming scissors. I say trimming scissors because your all-purpose or general purpose bonsai scissors, or certainly not secateurs, but those scissors tend to have a larger shank area and larger ears for where you put your hands through, and also a wider blade, which makes it a lot more difficult to get the blade into or the tool into the needles and without damaging them, in order to cut the candle neck. You can use a narrow branch cutter like this one. So before we start, we're going to make sure that we've got no deposits of resin from the previous work that you might have done with your scissors. And so I'm using a Cremate block. These scissors are already clean because I just cleaned them before a little while ago, so you're not seeing much of a change, but the resin build-up from pines is quite quick, so you may actually find that you would do this, perform this operation a couple of times during one sitting at a pine. It makes the more resin that deposits onto the scissors, the more difficult it becomes to open and close the scissors, and that in itself actually damages the tool. So it's a good idea just to make sure that you clean the tool, and to do that you're going to use a Cremate block and then also some natural oil. So I use jojoba oil, but just don't use a synthetic oil, and the idea behind that is that you don't, because this oil is then going to be in contact with the open tissue of the plant, that you don't want a synthetic oil coming into contact with that. Not saying that it would have any harm, but it is better just to use an organic oil instead. The other thing that I like to do is every time I'm about to work on a tree is just to sharpen my scissors or the tools that I'm going to be using. And in this case I'm just using a DMT diamond sharpener. And if you're keeping your tools in a sharp condition, or if you're looking after them, then you shouldn't have to use the other grades, certainly not the coarse or the medium perhaps, but if you are sharpening quite often, then you can just hone the edges with the fine diamond file, and that should be sufficient to give you a nice sharp cutting edge. And this is important because the sharper the blade, the less damage it's going to do when it cuts the plant tissue, and the less damage it does, the faster it's going to heal, and the less chance that you'll have any kind of infections entering into the plant. To do the actual decandling, what we're going to do, just for the purposes of recording the action, I'm trying to get up as close as possible, and you're going to slide your very sharp trimming scissors in around the base of the neck of the candle. So this is the neck here, there's no needles here, and you're going to look for the previous season's summer needles, which have now turned, they will be a different color. They'll be a deeper color green, whereas this season's needles will be this more lime green color. So you're going to look for those old needles, and at the base of that is going to be a neck. Now of the spring candle, which is what we're going to remove. And now position your scissors at 90 degrees to the candle, and then you're going to make the cut. Now the reason why it needs to be 90 degrees is because if this angle is at a 15, 30, 45 degree angle and it's not perpendicular, then the point of the cut is where a bud will form, and very likely a bud will not form on the opposite side of the cut, because the pressure of the sap is going to be into the angle, in the high point of that angle, and the bud will form there rather than on the opposite side. So it's important that this cut be as flat as possible. Something else that I referred to in a previous video was this idea of leaving a stub at the base of the spring candle. If versus cutting it all the way off to the needles, as I just described and demonstrated. So why you would do that is this tree is only going to be on my bench now. It's a customer's tree, and so it's only going to be on my bench this once, and then I'll only see it again during winter when further maintenance work is required. So in order for me to decandle now at one sitting, where you need to look for the strongest candles. So these are kind of the strongest candles. There are a few that have a little bit more of an extension, and then you're going to look at the weakest candle. So the weakest candles you're going to cut all the way to the base of the neck of the candle, and the strongest candles you're going to leave a few millimeters, say 5 millimeters of a stub left. And the purpose of that is so that the stub the sap first needs to recede from the stub, because no buds will form at the end of that stub. They can only form where the needles begin. And so you're going to retard or slow down that process on the areas that are currently very strong. And on the areas where you cut all the way to the base, the weaker candles, they will kind of get a bit of a head start on these cut points where you're leaving a stub, because immediately the sap can start pushing, or energy can be pushed into that area in order to make new buds. So in an area like this, which is kind of halfway, we're going to give it a few millimeters of a stub. So let's say 3 millimeters, and we're going to cut it. And now the sap will now recede at this stub, back down, and buds will then form where these needles are found. You know, with pines there are so many different variations of the technique, and it's important to know how to respond in each of these situations. Yeah, we have a bud that just never developed. Now, you might leave that as it is and hope that it'll develop. But if you cut that bud, you're stimulating it, and now buds will form on either side or down at the base here. Maybe we should actually cut it further back. And now we can stimulate this area to form new buds. If we look at the technique from a little bit of a distance, we're going to come in with a pair of tweezers. We're going to hold that candle, and we're going to make our cut, and then we bring the candle out and we just let it drop. There's no need to throw it anywhere. You can just let it drop. It takes time to flick it some way. So just bring it out, and you just need to really dislodge it from the area so it's not in your way, and then make the next cut. And we just go through the entire tree, repeating the same action. If I show you that in a little bit more close up, go in with the tweezers, find the base of the candle and cut it out. Next one, and we just flick it out of the way. So I like to work from the top of the tree down, and in this way it means that I'm cleaning the tree as I go along, because the candles will fall to the lower regions of the tree, and then as I go along I'll be removing those, and at the end obviously just anything that I might have missed will then be removed as well, but starting at the top of the tree and working down to the lower branches. I have now finished decandling this tree, and I just want to show you one or two more final points before we end off today's session. So although you are going to decandle the majority of the tree, when you get to situations like this where you have a weak branch, then you can leave those candles and don't cut them. What will happen then is that these are already growing, and so the tree is going to push more energy into these candles, and before it'll form buds on the other places that we've just now cut. And so these will strengthen, so it'll strengthen this branch. But for every other scenario, you're going to cut to a greater or lesser extent the candle. The decandling process will also sometimes produce back buds, like this one here. And this is very important for the future of the tree, because it's to these buds that you're going to cut these branches when they become too coarse. So it's important to get these, and it's important to nurture them and keep them growing healthy, so that one day when you need them, you can work back to, or cut back to those branchlets. Now, prior to this occasion, the last time you would have touched these trees, or this pine, would have perhaps been in winter, when you maybe wired it. This tree was wired during winter, so the owner needs to look out for wire bite in autumn, because that's when the tree will start to put on material and thicken up. So you'll need to watch out for wire bite. But before that, if you had needle plucked in autumn, which is when you should have done it, or is the most ideal time to do it, because that prepares the sort of determines the distribution of the buds that will develop in spring. So the majority of buds, or where they are placed, is determined by the amount of needles that you have in the various parts of the tree in autumn. So if you did do your needle plucking then the chances are that you will not have to needle pluck now. However, if the tree, if the candles developed very strongly, then you may need to remove more needles, so that the subsequent flush of needles, so in other words, the summer needles, won't be as large as the spring ones were. So you would do needle plucking now, but as this tree was needle plucked when I worked on it previously, and also the candles were not that strong that I feel that it warrants additional needle plucking. So I'm going to leave the needles, the quantity of needles as is. The next step from this would be to move the tree into a sunny position again, basically where it was standing before. Watering pretty much as normal. I don't think you'll really notice much of a difference. There may be a little bit less demand of water from the tree, because you've reduced the amount of needles on the tree, but it's pretty much the same. But no fertilizer for the next, probably in the next month, as the buds and candles are developing. So in about 2 to 3 weeks, you should, depending on the strength of your tree, how vigorous it is, you should see buds at the cut points. Hopefully 2 or more buds. If you have multiple buds, you can rub some of them off and just keep 2. But you ideally want 2, because you'll be increasing your ramification then if you get 2. If you only get 1, it's unfortunate, and better luck next time. So you haven't achieved the objective of ramifying that branch, because you still only have 1 growing tip. But then perhaps in the next season you can it'll improve, and you can then at that point maybe you'll get 2 when you decandle then. So I hope that you've enjoyed today's session, and that it was useful to you, the information was. If you haven't liked and subscribed to my channel, please do so now. And what would really be great is if you could share it with your friends or on your social media pages, so that others can also see it. I'd appreciate that. And as always, you're welcome to post your comments below, and I do try and answer them as soon as I can. But thanks very much for watching, and take care. Goodbye.